Finals of the Magnus Carlsen chess tour started today. 4 players battling it out. We had in one semi-final Magnus Carlsen himself playing against Ding Liren. And in the other semi-final we have Hikaru Nakamura playing against Daniel Dubov. And that is the match that I'd like to look at, and one game in particular. This match got off to an absolutely cracking start. Dubov defeated Nakamura in just 17 moves in that first game. Extraordinary. Nakamura hit back in the second. Well, he also had a bit of a bumpy ride there. And this is game 3 with the match tied at 1-1. Remember, it's rapid play. And Dubov repeated the line from that first game that he won in 17 moves. I mean, frankly, I didn't find it that interesting, although it's a complete crush, that 17 mover. But basically, Nakamura just made a slip in the opening and it was all over fairly quickly. But this game is a real cracker. Same variation as that 17 move win. And this line with bishop g5 against the Nimzo has been used a fair bit recently. Well, by Carlsen, for example, and others, and Dubov as well. So it's a real test against the Nimzo, because in playing the Nimzo, this bishop comes out to b4 and pins, very good. But it means that there's a problem on this diagonal. You can see there's a pin here, and that bishop really ought to go back to e7, as in proper Queen's Gambit positions. So this gives the game a really double-edged character. And there are other things going on when you play the Queen's bishop out very early. One, this pin can be an issue, but White hasn't actually done much about his kingside development. And here in that 17 move win, rook c1 was played, and that's quite a trendy line at the moment, but I don't particularly want to go into that. It was just a slip by Nakamura. Dubov played instead d5. Fair enough. So the game takes on the character of a kind of Benoni, actually, with this. It's also related to the so-called Leningrad variation against the Nimzo, where you play the bishop out to g5 very early. Spassky was a great exponent of this system. So as I said, it's a kind of strange Benoni structure, except this bishop is on this diagonal and not on the long diagonal. Knight d7. Protecting that knight means the queen is now free to move out. h6. Let's ask the bishop what it intends to do. And Dubov put it back on h4. It's also possible to play pawn to h4, actually. That's quite an interesting move, but anyway, that's another game for another time. Bishop h4 maintains the pin. Now black could play knight b6 to try and grab that pawn, but Nakamura plays queen a5 very quickly. So putting more pressure on the knight on c3, the pin knight, and also, you know, that pawn is under fire as well. So Dubov just castled and gave up a pawn. So bishop takes knight, and queen takes pawn on c3. Well, already I think we see the kind of playing styles of both players. Nakamura really brave, grabbing this pawn, neglecting his queenside development, and yeah, going on the rampage with his queen. Dubov very happy to give up material if he can get the initiative, and he has the 2 bishops, and he plays pawn to e4 here, and has some, you know, center as well. Bishop g3 has been played before. Not a bad move either. But e4 looks very natural. protecting the pawn on d5. Rook e8 puts some pressure on this pawn. Fair enough. Rook e1 defends. And now pawn to b5 from Nakamura. So that is a very bold move. And I have to say I like it. I think, you know, Nakamura is not a meek player. You know, he's prepared to strike out, prepared to grab this pawn. But, you know, he wants to try and wrestle the initiative from white. So pawn to b5. If bishop takes b5, then rook takes pawn on e4. And, well, still a very unclear situation, but actually you feel that black should be okay. You know, the queen isn't stranded on its own anymore. Black's pieces are coming out. Rook c1 played by Dubov, attacking the queen. Queen to a3. And now Dubov just tucked the bishop out of the way, just preempting any pawn strike, protecting the a-pawn, and yeah, ready for action on the king side, basically. e5 is an interesting move, I have to say. That was worth considering if you wanted to blast through straight away. But bishop e1 seems pretty good. Knight g4. So trying to get a little bit more hold over the e5 square. And remember that white doesn't just have designs on the king side, although, you know, this bishop is pointing in the right direction, but it's more than that. You know, this bishop could simply just nudge back here, looking at d6. And without a dark square bishop, difficult to defend that. So knight g4 prepares to put a piece on e5, so that looks reasonable. Knight d2 attacks the knight, and also prepares perhaps pawn to f4. Knight b6, bishop defends the knight. h3, pushing the knight, which goes into e5. And here, well, of course, we would love to play f4 and just drive forward with e5, or even f5, f6 on a good day. But there's a problem with f4, and that's that the knight comes back to g6, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn on g3, and you can't drop back to g3 because that queen will come all the way over. There you go. The queen looked kind of out on a limb on a3, but actually it does have some influence over the other side of the board. Could play bishop g3 here. That's possible. I mean, that's a much slower way of playing the position, but that's reasonable. You know, maybe white could play after that king h2 and build up for f4. But it is slower, of course. But instead, well, maybe that's not Dubov's way. He's in a hurry, and he played queen out to h5. As I always say, if you want to attack your opponent's king, it really helps to get your queen in the zone. Get your queen right in the face of the enemy king. Knight c4. Now, if that knight is exchanged, I have a feeling that Nakamura might have recaptured with the pawn. A couple of reasons. Might be able to bring that rook down to b2 to counter-attack. That would make an f-pawn advance less attractive when the g2 pawn on the second rank is vulnerable. And also in recapturing like this, the knight does have potentially a nice square to hop into on d3. So knight c4 just played, and Dubov decides to avoid that exchange, understandably, and plays knight b3. And Nakamura just continues straight on. Pawn to a5. Now I wonder, here Dubov played rook c3, which feels very natural to swing across to the king side. The other natural move is to play f4, of course. And, I mean, who knows, maybe this would have been a better practical try. I mean, black should be okay here. But once again, there's a problem. If bishop g3, then a4, and there's a pin there. But e5 is interesting. Give up that pawn, queen f3. Now, I'm sure that black is better here. But it's a chaotic position, and all these lines have been opened. So, who knows? But rook c3 looks good, but watch what happens. Queen b4, excellent move. So that rook can't swing across straight away because the rook on e1 drops. So the rook has to go to c1. So that drags it a little bit offside. Knight g6. So that blocks the g file. And maybe that can be exchanged off, the bishop. Bishop f6. Well, the game is reaching a climax now. If that's taken, then you can see that white... Well, with black's queen so far away, white's queen just looks tremendous on the king side, followed by potentially e5, rook g3, maybe the advance of the h-pawn. That is very difficult to defend against. So bishop f6, what do you play? Well, Nakamura just continued on. This is like a game of chicken. It's fantastic. Who is going to blink first? Who's going to back down? Well, it wasn't Dubov. Rook g3. He's just continuing on. And once again, if that's taken, then rook takes g6. Well, white would have a draw at the very least. Probably draw only, but still a draw. And if a takes b3, again you can take here and the queen breaks through. Let's just have a very quick look at that. So rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, threatening mate and the rook. So what do you play? It looks like Nakamura is in big trouble with the queen way across the other side of the board. But he comes up with a superb move. Rook to e5. Excellent move. So first of all, it attacks the queen. And if the queen drops back, then, well, the attack just fizzles, basically. Not great. Might even be possible simply to take that bishop. So white has to do something about that rook. So bishop takes rook. Knight takes. So why has Nakamura given up the exchange? Well, one, he's managed to exchange off that dangerous dark squared bishop. Two, he now has very good control over that f4 square. And actually the queen is a bit closer somehow to the king side as well. That exchange, or giving up the exchange, has been very useful. And that knight blockades securely on e5. So that pawn isn't moving. If that pawn's not moving, then that bishop doesn't come into the game. And yes, it's very important that that f4 square is covered. And let's just have a quick look at that, because f4 is the move we would love to be able to play with white. But then knight takes pawn, queen takes, looks dangerous, but no, knight e2 check. And for example, we can just take the rook. No danger. So now Dubov is in huge trouble. He might be the exchange up, but Nakamura has one pawn for it. This knight is attacked. You don't want to go in the corner. That looks just too ridiculous for words. And in fact, this simply is very, very good for black. This is just winning, actually. Attacks the queen, threatens check. So in this position, with the knight attacked, Dubov decides to go all in. Knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight. So now it's, let me see, two knights against a rook. Rook f1. Dubov still trying to force through f4, which could be dangerous. Queen d4, pinning. So that queen is actually able to rejoin, reconnect with the other side of the board. King h2, watch out. How are you going to deal with f4? Well, there's again, Nakamura comes up with a great idea. Rook a6. So I think the important thing is that these major pieces are now connecting with the other side of the board. And after f4, rook f6, excellent defense, pinning. And that would actually be fatal. for white, with the queen swooping down. So rook f6 played, pinning that pawn, attacking the f-pawn as well, which advanced, but really that's capitulation. With these pawns here, that bishop now isn't going to enter the game. That knight is securely posted on e5. Well, it moves, but black has control over this square. Rook d1, queen e5. That's why the knight was moved. And of course there's still a pin here. Different kind of pin in this case. And really now this is pretty easy. Queen d6. And yeah, coming back to that crucial e5 square. Nice little shuffle from Nakamura. And of course that's a bit unpleasant as well, that pin. And now, well, with black's kingside completely secure, he can turn his attention to the other side of the board and those wonderful pawns. So Nakamura's material up and positionally is completely winning, and these moves are not difficult. I mean, black could play really in any way he wanted here, just so long as that blockade is maintained. Dubov just can't touch black's position here. Okay, he gives up an exchange, gives an exchange back, but okay, so now let me see. It is, well, Nakamura is actually a piece up now, and it's really not very complicated for black. And the knight comes back into play. Very nice. Check. And knight e4. And that was the final move of the game. Game over. Dubov resigned. Well, if the queen comes here, knight d6. Blockade. Completely secure. Great game by Nakamura. And such, I think, a really good illustration of their different styles. Dubov just hell-bent on going for the king. Nakamura also playing very bravely. And grabbing that pawn, but somehow managing to reconnect and defend on the other side of the board. Thanks for watching.